Connie Dieter popped by CBC to tell us more about filing this complaint with the Human Rights Commission. Connie, why did you decide to do this?
I did this because I felt First Nations and Aboriginal women were going to be negatively affected by the cuts to STC, more so than perhaps other groups at this point. My reasons were that of the 61 or 66 missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Saskatchewan, 44% of them were murdered by acquaintances or strangers. And even more so after I've been doing more and more research is that a good deal of them, we have the highest in the country in terms of people that were murdered on highways and roads, which tells me that there's a definite concern.
There's a safety issue for Indigenous women in particular.
Yes.
And tell me about the risk that comes into play and why they depend on STC or had depended on it in the past so much, about what the service meant to them.
Well, for me, I travel a great deal between my home community, which is Abernethy, and my reserve, which is Pidlubny, to Regina to do work and whatnot. And I've traveled on the bus many, many times. And each time I've been on the bus, I've seen First Nations and Aboriginal women traveling on the bus, and it is really their lifeline, because many of the people in our community are poor. They don't have vehicles. And they're not, a great deal of our people don't have a license. So traveling on a public transportation system is the only answer for a good deal of them.
STC has been closed for a few short weeks now. Have you noticed any change in your travel back home to Abernethy with regards to maybe people trying to hitchhike, or how are people finding a way to get around where they used to use STC?
Well, 2 days ago I drove back to the reserve, and I was driving in the opposite direction in Fort Capel, and I saw a young man and his wife and his 3-year-old daughter, looks to be small, about 3 or 4 years old, with luggage and standing on the side of the road hitchhiking. And I have never seen that before. I've also noticed, a great many young men that are now hitchhiking, walking down the highway, that sort of thing. I've talked to my friends from the reserve, and they too are noticing that they're picking up more people. That whereas a month ago it was rare to see people hitchhiking, but now it's quite common in a lot of those rural areas.
The government said that it wasn't financially sustainable to maintain STC. It was a money loser. What's your argument to that? Why do you feel that that was something that they should continue to invest in even though it was losing money?
Because it's a service that binds Saskatchewan people, all of our people. We all need, we can't be living in isolation. We can't have those communities, mostly First Nations, who are living, on the reserve, and we can't be having people being isolated from the rest of the community, from our larger cities, those sort of things. Quite frankly, I think it's a human right to have access to public transportation. I think it's something that our government is just going to have to suck up and find different ways of funding this, because it's affecting not just First Nations women, it's affecting those who live in rural communities, those that have health concerns in terms of traveling to the city and don't have access or can't drive, seniors, disabled people. It's across the board, and it's really unfortunate that the Saskatchewan government hadn't discussed it or did any sort of consultations or looked at any sort of other plans in terms of just cutting down the system, shutting down the system right there and then.
Do you think there's a real chance that they could come up with something else?
I'm hoping that there's now pressure coming from outside of the province, that whatever it takes in order to get Brad and the boys to sit down and think of some ways, and maybe shortening the number of rides, trips, that sort of thing in a community. Instead of 4 or 5 trips a day, maybe 1 or 2 trips during the week, that sort of thing. There's some other alternatives that they could be looking at, and they should have been looking at, because, as I mentioned, I think it's a human right to have access to transportation.
Thanks for your time today, Connie.
Thank you.